All right, y'all, welcome back to the show. It's Antiwar Radio. I'm Scott Horton, and our first guest on the show today is William Norman Grigg. He keeps the blog Pro Libertate at freedominourtime.blogspot.com, and he's the author of the excellent book Liberty in Eclipse. Welcome back to the show. Will, how are you, my friend?
Scott, I'm doing well. Thank you so much for having me on again this morning.
Well, and thank you so much for joining us, especially on this short notice. You people always come through for me. By you people, I mean my wonderful guests that I bring on all the time. Yesterday, with seconds to spare, I got Patrick Coburn and Michael Hastings lined up before I went on the air here in L.A. on KPFK, and I kind of like working on a deadline. Ask Eric Garris, he'll tell you I'm always late, but I like working on a deadline.
Well, we're always eager to be on your show because it's a wonderful forum, and we appreciate everything you do.
Well, cool. So let's talk about the cops. I hate them, man. I just hate them, but Will, you're eloquent, so say it smart, man.
I am one of those people who, until relatively recently, had sort of a reflexive respect for police officers on the assumption that they represented the institutionalized effort to protect our rights. And contrary to my initial prejudices and over some reluctance, I've come to conclude that Edmund Burke, ironically enough, was right when back in 1756, as a very young man, he wrote an essay called A Vindication of Natural Society, in which he said that policed societies are unnatural social artifacts that rest on institutionalized terror, and that we have much more to fear from the so-called forces of order than we have from the unrestrained anarchic impulses of individual human beings.
Edmund Burke said that? Come on, he must have been kidding.
Well, he was very young, and unfortunately his views sort of calcified as he got older, but I don't think that he ever really overcame a suspicion that characterized a lot of his politics regarding the exercise of fundamentally unaccountable government power. That's one of the critiques that he offered with respect to the French Revolution, that rather than replacing absolutism, they had taken the worst elements of absolutism and multiplied them several-fold. But way back in his youth, when he was still feeling his oats and perhaps had a commendable, instinctive, distrust of constituted authority, he did write about what he called policed societies. And I was one of those people, once again, who assumed that of all the implements of coercion that government has at its disposal, that police were somehow, if you will, sort of a qualified representative of that function of government. Because without the police, of course, we would supposedly be at the mercy of those who would seize our property and threaten our lives. The problem here is that the obvious priorities of any government law enforcement agency begin with force protection. That's something that's become very obvious now. The prime directive of anybody who's wearing a state-issued costume, replete, of course, with state-issued costume jewelry, and given a weapon and then clothed in the supposed authority to push people around and kill them, his first priority is to make sure that he gets home that evening safe and that his comrades likewise are able to return from their shift safe. Their first priority, their prime directive, is officer safety. Second on that list would be the maintenance of the public order that provides them with their livelihood. That is to say, their second priority is to make us submit, and then somewhere down on that list, incidental to this entire proposition, is the idea that they might have some marginal benefit to the public in terms of protecting us from criminal violence, or at least punishing those who commit criminal violence. But my studies over the last 5 or 6 years have led me to believe that that is, as I said, incidental to what police do. They are first and foremost interested in protecting themselves individually and institutionally, and secondly, they are the apparatus of enforcement for the government that rules us.
All right, now, I read Anatomy of the State, and Murray Rothbard says that's the name of the game that always has been. There is no such thing as a government that's really a security force. All these people are the criminals who robbed you and then followed you home and insisted on being your protection racket, no different than the North Jersey mob, only with shinier costumes or whatever, with pretended authority that the mob just takes.
I would actually prefer to find myself at the mercy of the New Jersey mob, and once again I find myself referring to Edmund Burke. He pointed out, and I'm paraphrasing, of course, that he would actually rather take his chances with somebody who is a private criminal, somebody who's exercising violence and expressing his malign motives by a direct face-to-face assault, because he can defend himself against somebody who is a private criminal, But if he finds himself on the receiving end of officially sanctioned violence, if he succeeds in resisting that violence, the people who are in charge of vindicating the supposed authority of the state will not relent until something is done to destroy him. And so he appreciated way back in the mid-18th century what you might call the Waco Dynamic, which is that if you resist successfully a criminal assault by people who are agents of the state will pitilessly and remorselessly escalate until you and everybody around you has been destroyed. And that's something that Rothbard understood. Burke, as I pointed out, understood it long ago. I'm a little slower on the uptake. It took me 20 or so years of engagement in public issues before I finally reached that conclusion.
Well, I think like you, I used to be more of a conspiracy theorist, and it used to be, to me, more about, the Rockefellers or the Skull and Bones or the personal networks of power. It's always, some Standard Oil lawyer that's the Secretary of State or whatever. And then I ended up realizing that, the state is the conspiracy that I'm against. And I don't prefer the AEI to the CFR when it comes down to it. I kind of want the CFR back.
I'm not, of course, of the opinion that any of the groups or individuals or institutions you mentioned are commendable in any sense, but they tend to be, if you will, symptoms of the underlying problem. The underlying problem, of course, is the praxis of coercion that we refer to as the state. That's what Rothbard pointed out. Good grief, Augustine pointed out the city of God over 1,500 years ago when he talked about the famous parable of the pirate and the emperor, or in that famous passage in Book 4, I think it's Book 4, Chapter 4, where he says, justice being taken away, what are kingdoms but vast robberies? He understood how that racket worked. He wasn't entirely on my page in terms of a philosophy of individual freedom, but he certainly diagnosed the problem correctly.
Yeah, indeed. Well, so now you talk about officer safety as paramount and all this. And you know what I wonder is, I guess I'm feeling old. I got a few white hairs on my chin now. I'm 10 years older than my new roommate, and he's a full-grown adult, so there's a problem there, I realize. But, when I was a kid in the 1980s, I just remember being 4, and these are the people in your neighborhood. And all that on Mr. Rogers, or was that Sesame Street? And the sheriff, the Travis County sheriff, he was one of the people in my neighborhood. And when I was like in kindergarten, maybe first grade, around that age, if we saw a sheriff while we were walking to school, we would wave at him or whatever. Maybe that's a Texas thing too. Everybody just waves at everybody. But
sure.
But we just assume, like, oh, good, that's the guy. I recognize the car and the shiny badge and whatever from the propaganda. He's the guy even though I don't know him. He's a stranger to me. He's a guy that I can trust by default. He's here to protect me, whatever. I believed that when I was a little kid. But you know what I wonder? I wonder whether that's even plausible to a little kid now. I mean, I believed that up until I was about 11 and started skateboarding and had to actually deal with a cop in real life myself. And, nobody ever held a gun to my head in my life except a Williamson County sheriff. So I learned really young about who these people really are and how they really think and how they really treat people. But I wonder now whether a 4-year-old would even believe Mr. Rogers that these are the people in my neighborhood at all, or whether they would just say, yeah, right, dude, these are the enemies in my neighborhood.
That proverbial 4-year-old might believe that, but he really shouldn't. The default assumption should be that if you're dealing with somebody who represents the government ruling us, you're dealing with the most dangerous personality within eyeshot. And in trying to raise our children, Corinne and I, my wife Corinne and I, are trying to instill in my children 2 attitudes which may seem contradictory, but I think they're complementary. The first is that they should be, by default, respectful towards everybody, including people who are government employees, while looking on government employees in particular as people who are highly suspect in terms of what they can do to them and what they can do to our family. We've had a couple of experiences in our lives over the last couple of years where we found ourselves on the receiving end of completely unwanted and unwelcome attention by the forces of public order, including one incident where we were hotlined by some very kind anonymous informant for supposed child abuse, and I had to get my family out of the county and then come back and confront the police. That was I think, a ironically useful incident in terms of forming the attitudes of our kids.
Yeah, well, and I urge people to read about that. Just go to Pro Libertate and search around for, I don't know, the CPS. Maybe we'll give them a couple good keywords when we get back, the title of a piece, because that's a very interesting read, that story.